Thank you. You may be seated. As we expressed a moment ago, we are again so appreciative of your presence this morning. So glad you're here with us as we attempt in our feeble way to proclaim the unsearchable riches of the kingdom of God. And hope and trust and pray that as we study together from God's Word this morning, something that we say might be a source of strength and encouragement and edification to you. You'll leave here, you'll be builded up in the most holy faith, and you'll say it was good to have been in the Lord's house this morning. You know, in case you have been living a Rip Van Winkle type of existence, you haven't watched any cable news, you haven't picked up a newspaper, you haven't turned on a news broadcast, haven't talked to anyone on the street. If you're not really up on current events, we are living in a time of great change. In fact, this year, 2020, has actually been one earth-shaking event after another. This is most definitely a year when you do not want to make the statement or ask the question, what next? Because likely you're going to find out. We've seen this world shaken to its very core with a pandemic called COVID-19. And because of this, we've had lockdowns, mask orders, stay-at-home orders, and every other kind of order you can possibly imagine. There are some states where churches have been forbidden by government officials to sing in public worship, and now there are states where government officials are forbidding them to gather for public worship. We have to wear a mask to go to the grocery store or Walmart or anywhere else. I never thought I'd see the day that you could just openly walk into a bank wearing a mask and nobody thinks anything at all about it. We've seen riots in the streets. We've witnessed the destruction of statues and monuments to our national heroes. We've watched as police have been assaulted, assassinated, and vilified. As to what comes next, no one really knows. And if someone were to ask this morning, Tim, what's the end result of all of this going to be? I would have to give what I would consider the wisest answer I could give, and that is, I don't know. Well, what if someone says, what kind of a world are we going to live in when all of this is over? My friends, we can give no sure and definite answer to that question. We are ignorant of the future of our nation, and we are ignorant of the future of our world. We are also just that ignorant of what awaits each of us individually. But I want to say this morning, boldly and confidently, in the middle of all of these uncertainties, there is something that we can be sure of. Not all of life is a matter of guesswork or choice. Not all of life is a matter of chance. There are some roads of life that we can walk with assurance. And there are some roads of life we can walk with confidence. There are some solid certainties that we can lean our weak and weary shoulders against in times like these. Even in the tempestuous days that we are living in, we can lean against these certainties and know that they will not let us down. The Apostle Paul was a man who lived through many tempestuous days. To Paul, tomorrow was an unknown quantity. He had no blueprint for the future any more than you and I do. But there was something that Paul was certain of. Something that gave him a quiet and calm heart. There was one great assurance that Paul leaned against with absolute confidence. Here's what he says. We know He declared that triumphantly. We know that to them that love God, all things work together for good. That's the text we want to look at this morning in the 11th or the 8th division of the Roman letter and the 28th verse. We know that to them that love God, all things work together for good. To be sure, my friends, Paul did not mean that everything that happens in our world is good. Paul did not conclude that because we have a good and a loving God, nothing but good things happen. Quite naturally, we would all like to have a faith in a God of that kind. The problem is, the grim facts of life tear a faith such as that to shreds and to tatters. And to cling to a faith that everything is good, that nothing but good is going to happen, to cling to that kind of a faith, we must deceive ourselves. We cannot have a faith like that unless we deliberately close our eyes to reality. To be able to announce that there is no such thing as sin and sickness and death, oh, wouldn't that be great? The only problem is, it simply would not be true. Paul was not making the assertion that everything that comes into our world is good. And neither was he making the assertion that every good thing brings about a good result. Now, on the surface, it would seem like that might be the case. But actual experience proves the opposite of that. When we look at our own lives, when we look at the lives of our friends and acquaintances and those we come in contact with, we cannot close our eyes to the fact that oftentimes folks have a way of turning their advantages into disadvantages. I've known folks that loved the Lord and served the Lord, and they were humble, and as far as the things of this world, the things of this world in their lives were meager. And then something happened and turned all of that around. And their existence was no longer meager, but it was prosperous, more prosperous than they'd ever imagined. And the more prosperous they became and the more they were blessed, the further and further and further they grew away from God. So what is Paul saying? He's telling us that to them that love God, all things work together for good to them. Whether it be good or bad, whether it makes for laughter or tears, for sunshine or darkness, for poverty or for wealth, for pleasure or pain, it all works together for good. But then what does he mean by loving God? He does not mean mere sentiment and I love God. He also does not mean a great tide of emotion where someone gushes, oh, I just love the Lord, I love God so much, I just love the Lord. Jesus said in John 14 and verse 15, Jesus said, if you love me, keep my commandments. Folks, to love God is to obey God. To love God is to live my life within the will of God. To love God is to find the way that God is walking and walk with God in God's way as did Enoch of old. So what is the truth of that statement? What is the validity of that statement? When Paul says we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, is it true or is it not true? Will this work in any day and in any time? Will it work under any circumstances? Will it work in my life? Will it work in your life? Will it work when the funds are low and the debts are high and we're facing financial ruination? Will it work when we're sick and pain is walking on every nerve in our body and even stopping and jumping up and down on some of them? Will it work when the sea of life is smooth and calm? Will it work in a world where petty despots seem on the point of wrecking our total way of life and everything we hold dear? Paul was certain in making this assertion. And he was certain that he was stating a universal truth. Personally, I firmly believe with every fiber of my being this morning that he was right. His faith is a reasonable faith. Now, let's understand something. It's reasonable. Not because God is accustomed to shielding His saints. Oftentimes, in our humanity, we're eager to coddle our children. We pamper them, we indulge them, and oftentimes we're overprotective. We want to spare them from the heartaches and the hurts and the disappointments of this life. Now, maybe sometimes we go a little overboard in the other direction, trying to make sure we don't shield them too much. I'm probably going to get in trouble for this, but when Norm and I were raising our boys, we were determined we weren't going to raise a couple of sissies. And I was coaching Little League football, and Ryan came over to me one afternoon at practice and rubbing his hand. I said, "What's wrong, son?" He said, "I hurt my hand." I looked at him and said, "Wiggle your fingers." He wiggled his. I said, "You're fine. Go on out there and play." So he finished up practice. The next day he dressed and he went out and I made him play. And his hand was swelling and his mother took him to the doctor and they x-rayed it. Found out he had a fractured growth plate in his hand. I felt kind of bad then, but I was determined to not shield him from everything. And yet, undeniably, we want to shield our children in certain ways. God does not make that mistake with us. That night that Jesus gathered his little handful of friends together to eat the Passover with them, he told them, "I'm leaving." He said, "But I'm going to the Father and I'm going to prepare a mansion for you there, and you can come to me there." And telling them he was leaving, Jesus knelt and he prayed with them. But Jesus did not pray that that little handful of friends would lead a sheltered life. He did not seek protection for them from the rude winds that blow through our world. Here's what he prayed. Listen to it. "I pray not," Jesus said, "I pray not that thou shouldst take them out of the world, but that thou shouldst keep them from evil." That's in John 17, verse 15. In spite of his love for them, and in spite of his loyalty to them, and their loyalty to him, every one of those men suffered. Paul himself did not lead an altogether sheltered life. Paul had lived through all sorts of experiences. There had been some folks that had loved Paul with a passionate devotion. And there had been others that had hated him with an intensity that made them want to shed his blood, and the sooner the better. Paul had known every kind of hardship imaginable. He had spent a night and a day in the waters clinging to the bit of a wreckage of a ship. He tells us in one place in one of his letters, he had suffered the loss of all things. There was probably not a hardened criminal anywhere in the Roman Empire that had seen the inside of more Roman jails than Paul had seen. Paul had been to the whipping post so many times that if he'd gone to heaven backwards, they would have recognized him because of the scars on his back. So when Paul said in Romans 8, we know all things work together for good to them that love God, he did not think that this was because God pampered and spoiled his children and sheltered them from hardships. There is truth in this assertion Paul makes. There is validity in this assertion that Paul makes. Because you see, that man or that woman who loves God stands up to life. They meet even those things that are difficult because they believe it is God's will to face them. The person who loves God is the person who stands up boldly to the difficulties that life brings. And facing those difficulties, facing life, they find that their conflicts are changed by the help of God into conquests. Folks, in these days that you and I are living through, this is a most thrilling truth for us. Because this passage tells us that we do not need to be victims of circumstances. It does mean that sometimes life deals more harshly with some than it does with others. There are those who walk merrily on until something happens to trip them up. And having once fallen, there are some who wallow in self-pity and blame others. They blame God. They blame everyone around for their failure and their circumstances. They blame their friends. They blame the situation. They blame God. And they loudly proclaim, "Woe is me. Look how my friends have failed me. Look how God has failed me. Look how the deck has been stacked against me." And when facing the facts, the real cause for their failure is not in what they suffered. And why can I say this? Because I have known some who love the Lord, that life dealt just as harshly or harsher than it did with those who proclaimed, "Woe is me." And yet, in spite of the difficulties, in spite of the hardships, in spite of the circumstances, they lived richly, joyously, victorious in the service of God. You see, we forget something sometimes. When Paul said all things work together for good, he's talking about our ultimate good. Like the song we sing, "This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through." You see, our ultimate good is not this earth. Our ultimate good is heaven. You might think about it in terms of a pharmacist. Now you go to the pharmacy and most of the time nowadays they pour some pills out of a bottle, they count out the number the doctor's prescribed and pour them into a bottle and hand it to you across the counter. But there are still some of those pharmacies that are known as compounding pharmacies, where the doctor will write out a prescription and they actually have to take the various ingredients and mix them, then compound them together for your medication. And oftentimes, there's one ingredient in that medication that by itself and in enough of a quantity might be enough to kill you. But mixed together with everything else, it becomes a healing agent for whatever disease might be attacking your body. Well, picture God as the master pharmacist of our lives, mixing and controlling the events of our lives molding us here below to be fit subjects for heaven. You see, Paul said, we know all things work together for good. Not our good necessarily in this life, but our good making us fit subjects for heaven and for being with God throughout all of eternity, world without end. Look around us. Life can sometimes be complex and muddled. Life can oftentimes be worse than one of those 1,000 or 2,000 piece jigsaw puzzles that I've never been able to work. In fact, life sometimes reminds me of the story I read not long ago about this girl that called her boyfriend on the phone. She was in tears. She called him. She said, I have tried to put this puzzle together. It's a puzzle of a beautiful tiger. And I poured all the pieces out on the table, and I can't get any of them to fit together. Please come and help me. I'm just so frustrated. He said, maybe I'll be right over. So he went over. He looked things over. And she said, what are we going to do? He said, we'll take care of it. He said, first of all, we're going to go out to dinner. We're going to have a very quiet dinner together. We're not even going to think about this, and we're not even going to talk about this. We're just going to enjoy our dinner, and then when we come back home, I'll help you put all of the frosted flakes back into the box. I'll let you guess what color her hair was. Life sometimes is that way for us, especially right now. But because of what Paul tells us here, we don't have to puzzle over how we can change our losses into gains. All we have to do is live the very best that we know how to live within the will of God. And doing that, God will see to it that whatever happens to us will make for our ultimate good to spend eternity with Him in that land of faith this day. And through the power of God, the darkest days of our life can often become the brightest sunshine we'll ever know. And living within the will of God, living within the will of God, we will be able to say with Paul, I know that all things work together for good to them that love God. What about you this morning? You see, for everything and for all things to work together for our good, we've got to be living within the will of God. Are you doing that? Is Jesus Christ the Lord and Master of your life this morning? If Jesus Christ is not Lord and Master of all of your life, then Jesus Christ is not Lord and Master at all in your life. And if Jesus Christ is not the Lord and Master of your life, you're not living within the will of God. Do you need to make changes? Do you need to make changes in your life so that Jesus Christ is Lord and Master of all of your life? If you do, this is your opportunity to do that as together we stand and while we sing.